Good morning, everyone. I'm at Victoria Bryant State Park, and I'm here for a couple of reasons today. One, I need an image for my book, and as you all probably know now if you've seen other episodes, I'm in the production stage for my second book called Naturally Georgia, and I need to get images from all over. And this isn't an area of Georgia I've spent a lot of time in, even though it's not too far from Athens. I'm going to try to capture something today that I can use in the book. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. The light is pretty good. I'm going to try to get something with the water, because I think the water feature here is probably the prettiest part of this park. And there's a real cloudy, overcast day, so I've got the light for it. I'll just see if I can find a composition. And secondly, I thought I would do an episode on focus stacking, because it's something that I do a lot of, and it's not really that hard to do. You just have to kind of understand the workflow, and so I'm going to show that to you. So this is going to be kind of a field episode that transitions into post-processing to actually do the focus stacking. And thirdly, I guess, I just want to introduce my new dedicated photography adventure vehicle. It's not new, it's very old. We bought my wife a new SUV, and instead of trading this in for a paltry sum of money, basically kept it, and I am going to use it as my dedicated photography vehicle. I'm going to just fill it. I've already kind of filled it with all of my gear and things that I would need out in the field. It's old, it's high mileage, but it will go anywhere that I need it to go here in Georgia. I can cross creeks with it, I can go down Forest Service roads, and I don't have to worry about babying it at all. So I'm actually really excited. I'm about as excited as anybody can be for a 2008 Honda CR-V with 150,000+ miles on it. So in the coming episodes, you'll see as I kind of add more and more to this and really make it mine when it comes to photography. I might end up sleeping in it sometimes too. We'll see. It's a little bit small for that, but I'm not a real big person, so that might work. But I'm about to just go out and walk around. I've got lots of time today, nothing going on, and the light is not going to change anytime soon. If nothing else, it's going to rain. For water, that's perfect. Let's see what we find. So I'm already seeing the value of my new photography vehicle, because before I left, I threw in a bunch of things that I knew I would need eventually out in the field. And one of those is hip waders. I found a spot here that has some potential. It's got some real texture to the water, lots of rocks, but it's pretty deep and it's cold. And so I'm gonna go get my hip waders and put them on so I can access the area of the stream that I think would be best for my composition. So let me tell you about what I'm doing here. I kind of walked around, I found this one rock jutting out, and I've got the water kind of parting around it, and I'm going to focus stack it. And so I'm going to focus on the rock itself, and then I'm going to focus further away. I'm going to shoot that at an aperture of f8, f11, maybe f16. There's pros and cons to all of that, and I'm going to talk about that here with you in a minute. But I walked around a little bit. I'm okay with how this image is coming out, but the rock is kind of submerged, so it's not sticking out as much as I want it to because the water is washing over it. So I'm shooting it in a lot of different shutter speeds and I'm taking a lot of different exposures so I can use the best one out of all of them. So hopefully you can see this. I'm focusing here. You can see where the rock is sticking out. So I'm doing a shot there, shooting it at f10. I could also shoot it at f13, f16. The smaller your aperture, or I guess the shallower your depth of field, the more exposures you're going to have to take to stack it all. But because I'm shooting really wide, I can get away with shooting this at, like, we're going to say f13 and take that picture. And then I can also shoot, I can focus up here a little further ahead and take that picture. And those are going to get blended together. Sometimes you have to take 2, 3, 4 different images depending on how close things are to your lens, how wide your lens is. There's a lot of different factors, and so it takes some experimentation. I always check to make sure things are sharp afterwards too. And you can see there, everything there far away is sharp, but this rock here close is pretty soft. But I'd already taken one earlier of the rock, so that's going to be sharp. Those are going to be the ones that I blend together. Another thing that I'm doing is I'm shooting the water at different exposures. The water is all blurred, so I don't have to worry about the focus as much on the water, but I'm shooting it at longer exposures and shorter exposures so that I can then blend the water in Photoshop as well. I'm going to show you all how to do that. So I've been adjusting my shutter speed and my ISO so that I can get my shutter speed much slower or much faster, depending on if I'm shooting rocks or the water. And so you'll see when I bring this all into Photoshop how I'll blend it together. So let me talk for a minute about the aperture and what it does and depth of field, because that's pretty essential when it comes to focus stacking your images. You have to understand what your aperture is doing to the photo. So essentially, the number and the description of the aperture are kind of different. So a small aperture is actually a big number on your camera. A small aperture lets in just a little bit of light, but it increases your depth of field. So if you're shooting at, like, say f16, your aperture is quite small on the camera. It's not letting much light in, so you need a faster shutter speed, or a slower shutter speed actually, a longer shutter speed, in order to let in the amount of light that is needed to expose the image. So f16 gives you a depth of field that's pretty wide. Like f2.8, f2.0, it's a big aperture. It lets in a lot of light. So you don't want too much light to come in and hit the sensor, so your shutter speed is very fast, like maybe 1/500th of a second if it's sunny conditions. So you're not going to get any blur, any movement to water or clouds or anything like that with that fast of a shutter speed. f2.0, f2.8, f3.5, those are very shallow depths of field. That creates a blur or bokeh, and it kind of blurs the background behind your subject. So if you want things sharp from close to your lens all the way to the horizon, then you need a pretty big depth of field, which means you need to shoot at like f16. F16 a lot of times, if you don't have anything real close to your lens, will get everything sharp in your image. But here's the catch, and this is where you have to use your judgment. f16 is not as sharp with your lens as, say, f8 or f9 or f11. That's the lens sharpness sweet spot. Okay, and so if you want the sharpest image possible, you need to shoot everything around f9 and then adjust your ISO and your shutter speed accordingly. However, you're not getting as much depth of field there, so you're going to have to focus stack more images to get everything sharp from the front to the back. So there's a trade-off. Most of the time when I focus stack, I focus stack at f16 because I have very expensive lenses that have acceptable sharpness at f16. And by acceptable, I mean I can make big enlargements and they still look good. But if I want tack sharp, then I'm going to stop down my lens to f8, f9, f11, and focus stack more. One other thing to be aware of, the closer you have things to your lens, if you have something really, really close to your lens and you want it to be sharp and you want everything on the horizon to be sharp, you might have to focus stack 2 or 3, perhaps even 4 exposures with focus points from the closest thing possible all the way out to the horizon. As you get further and further away from the lens, you don't have to focus stack as much. Everything remains pretty sharp pretty far away, like 2/3 of the distance and beyond is going to be sharp no matter what if you focus out there. It's the things that are closer to the lens that you might have to focus stack in steps. And so I'm saying like 3 feet from the lens, then 7 feet from the lens, then 12 feet from the lens. Those might have to require multiple times of focus that you focus stack together. And so I'm about to leave the park here. I got an acceptable image. I'm actually going to drive around and see if I find anything else, but as far as filming here, I'm done. Let's move our images into Photoshop, into Lightroom and then Photoshop, so I can show you how to focus stack them correctly. Here we go. This is where the magic happens. We've got the images. We were out in the field, took enough images to make sure everything was sharp. And now we're going to put them into Lightroom and then into Photoshop to focus stack them. Let me just mention something real fast before we get started. If you noticed on my screen just a little bit ago, I was adjusting the ISO a little bit in order to adjust my shutter speed. And some of you might be wondering why I wasn't adjusting the aperture. I wanted to keep that aperture pretty kind of stopped down, so f13, f16-ish, to give me a greater depth of field. And so if I don't want to move my aperture around, what I have to do then is adjust the ISO or put on an ND filter. And so ISO 50 to 125, even 200 isn't going to make a big difference with your image quality unless you're printing really, really huge and you've got a lot of shadows and you're worried about your detail there. So I got a little lazy. I didn't get out the ND filter. And so that's my explanation for why you saw my ISO changing and why I was adjusting that and keeping that aperture steady. So let's get started with the edit. All right, so here we are. We've got these images. These are the images after kind of sorting through the ones that I took. These are the ones that I'm going to use. Now, will I use all of these? Not necessarily. Some of these I might end up not using, but I always send everything that I think I might end up using over to Photoshop, and that's where I really start to sort through them. So the first thing you can do, just to make sure they're all calibrated and everything, is to select all of them, all of the ones that you're going to make your edits to in Photoshop, and go into Develop and scroll down, and let's go ahead and do any type of lens adjustments that have to be made. So we're going to enable profile corrections, and we're going to remove chromatic aberration. And so we've done that, and then all you have to do is right click on any of these images and you go Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop. And so now I've got all of those layers loaded here. And so I'm going to go through them, and everybody does this probably differently. There's no right or wrong way to do it. As long as you kind of know what you're doing, you make sure you've got it all organized. But what I like to do is I like to move to the top my focus stack images first. I actually have more exposures here, more frames here than I will need for my focus stack. I only needed 2 to focus stack this particular scene. Sometimes you might need to do 3 or 4, but the rock was far enough away from my lens that all of this ended up being in focus, and then all of this ended up being in focus in my second frame, so I only needed 2. All of these other frames are going to be for me to kind of paint in the exposure of the water. More blur, less blur, whatever I kind of want to go after. But first I need to check my sharpness and get those at the top because I'm going to work with those first. So I'm going to zoom in here on this top one and see, I'm going to look at that rock. That rock looks kind of sharp. It's got water rushing over it. I don't love it. So I might go find a different one. So I'm just going to turn that one off and look at this one. This one's a little better. You can see it is pretty reasonably sharp. So I might end up going with this one. So I'm just going to move this to the very top, but I'm going to turn it off. Now the background is pretty sharp. So now my background in this one is quite sharp. You can see all of these rocks are sharp. You can see all these trees and leaves are sharp. So this was one of my distant focus images. So I'm going to move this one up below my close focus image. And those two are probably going to be the ones I blend together. But I'm going to go ahead and look at the rest of them. Notice now I'm getting different exposures. This is a blurry rock, distant exposure or distant focus, but it's a little bit, look at how the water changes between the two. This water here, pretty sharp, and it's got a nice flow to it. Let's look at the next one. Kind of the same. This one, much brighter water. So I might brush in a little bit of this brighter exposure and into certain areas that I want the eye to go. So I might use this one as an exposure blend instead of a focus stack. So I'm going to not use this one right now, but I am going to I'm going to keep it lit for now just so I'll remember it. And actually I'll go ahead and move it up below these two. These two here are going to be my focus stack. This one here I might use for exposure. And let me look at this last one here at the bottom. Again, not a huge difference between the two. This one's a little brighter. I'll use this one because these other ones are darker. So these are the three that I'm going to end up using. Let me turn these off and look at these others one last time. You know, this, I might end up keeping one of these as well. Now, I haven't done this before filming this, before recording this episode. So you're kind of just going through with me in real time. Like, look at the bubbles right there. That's kind of interesting to me. That might be interesting in the final version. Let me see if those bubbles are on the bright one. They're not. See how that changes? So I might end up using this frame just for those bubbles right there, and maybe in a couple other areas. So what I'm going to end up with now, I've got these top two that are my focus stack. Okay, so let's look at this. I've got this sharp rock that is kind of protruding from the water here. So this is my best frame of this sharp rock. And I've got this here blurred in the background, but notice if I turn this off, that is all sharp in the background. So these two I'm going to do my focus stacking with. These remaining three, I'm just going to paint in exposures if I want to use them. So I'm just going to set these aside. I'm going to turn them off for now just so I'm not even looking at them. I'm going to focus stack these two. So before I do any focus stacking, I'm going to make sure all of these are lined up. Okay, there can be slight small movements of the camera and the tripod because of the rushing water, because I bump it and all of that. Need to make sure every single image is perfectly lined up with each other. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of these, and I'm going to go up to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And I'm just going to take the defaults. Okay, it's going to run its Photoshop magic in the background, and they are all going to be perfectly aligned here in a few seconds. All right, there we go. Notice how there's a little bit of edge showing now. That's because it had to shift the images around slightly. No big deal. I'll crop it here at the end, or I could crop it right now if this bothers me. And sometimes it does. Sometimes I'll go ahead and crop it. But we'll get rid of that before we're done with this image. So now these are all perfectly aligned, which is important. And so now I'm just really worried about these top two. Now there's two ways to do a focus stack. Okay, you can do it manually or you can let Photoshop do it. Let me show you the manual way first. Okay, so typically the Photoshop way works pretty well, but it's not always perfect. Sometimes it messes up, and so the manual way sometimes gets a little bit easier, especially when you're dealing with something real clean. Like we have a perfect front to back with no leaves hanging in, no other weird things that could cause issues because they're real close to the lens, but directly behind them is much further from the lens. That gets to be pretty complicated, but this is a pretty easy focus stack. This I want sharp. All of this I want sharp. Right now everything back there is blurry because it is underneath this top image. Notice how sharp that gets when I turn off the top image, right? So what do I want to do? I can have this top image, if I put a mask on it, which is white. That means white means everything on that image is showing right now. You can see it. okay? If I turn anything in this white black, if I use the brush tool and I brush in black, wherever I brush the black ink, it will reveal underneath it the next image, which is this one. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go to my brush tool, I'm going to change my brush size by a lot, I'm going to go to my opacity and just take it to 100, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using black as my ink. And look what happens now when I paint in this black. It is going to reveal the image underneath, just like that. I'm going to go over it one more time, just to make sure. And now I have pretty much a perfectly sharp image front to back. How do I know? Because I can zoom in like crazy and see that this rock and these bubbles here are sharp. And then as I go up, you can't even see the transition point because of the way the water was flowing. This is an easy focus stack to do. But look now at how sharp all that is back there. I probably, very likely, would not be able to get things this sharp at f16 or even f20 or f22. So this is something that modern technology allows us to do because we can use this digital darkroom to stack our images. And just like that, I'm ready. I'm ready to start editing. I've got everything in this image sharp. So I'm going to delete this mask here that I just created, and I'm going to let Photoshop do this. So sometimes you just let Photoshop do it for you, but it's not always perfect, and sometimes you have to go in and make some edits and stuff like that to it. But let me show you how Photoshop would do this. I'm going to just select these top two images. Those are the only two that I'm focus stacking, and I'm going to go up to Edit, Auto Blend Layers, Stack Images, Seamless Tones and Colors. Okay, now it's going to work its magic, and it can determine what is sharp and what isn't. But I have a lot of flowing water in this, so it might get a little confused at times. We're going to see how this looks here in a second. And there we go. It's done. You can see the mask it created. All right, so white it kept and dark it didn't. So it kept everything that you see there that's white. It got rid of everything that was black and showed the image underneath. So basically, it got rid of all of this on this top image and showed what was underneath. But also, it got a little confused here. You see how it also, over here on the left-hand side, it has that kind of black as well. So Photoshop did not do as nice of a job as I would do with this particular image. So let's take a look at it. It's still going to look pretty good. Photoshop, I'm guessing, did a reasonably good job. I think it probably got confused with the water the most because the water is moving through each of the images. But I'm looking here. Oh, yeah, it looks pretty sharp. You can see along the side it filled in a little bit there on the side, which I don't love. It got a little confused there. You can see if you turn it on and off what parts it kept of the top image and what parts it didn't. Yeah, look right there. So it messed up right there. So Photoshop did not do as good of a job as I did with my manual focus stack. You can see here again, when I turn it on and off, you really notice the difference there. So I can either go in and edit these masks manually now to fix Photoshop's mess up, which I'm not going to do. I'm just going to go with the one that I created. Or you can do it completely manually like I did earlier on in this episode. So I'm going to go with the completely manual one, and I'm glad I did them both for you so you can see that Photoshop is not perfect, and especially when you're dealing with moving water, it really gets confused sometimes. All right, so here we are back to mine. I think mine works better. Obviously it does. I kind of showed you all that. I'm going to go in and crop it so I don't have to look at what Photoshop did there. So I'm going to go in and crop it. I'm going to just crop this in a little. I don't need all of this. I might end up cropping it again before it's all said and done. But now it's time to exposure blend. So I'm going to keep that crop. let me just show you how I approach exposure blending. And I'm going to show you something that I've found to be really, really useful to manage a bunch of layers. So these top two, I should have probably renamed them. But these top two are my focus stack. I'm not going to make any more edits. I'm not going to blend these together or anything. These are what I care about when it comes to sharpness. So I'm going to put those two into a group or a folder. Okay? I could even rename this focus stack. I'm not going to touch that. Okay? Those are done. I'm done with those layers. But here underneath, I do have these layers that have different brightness values to the water and different movement. Some of them are shot with a shorter or longer shutter speeds. Let's turn this off for a second and look at this. All I'm looking at now is the water and kind of what the water is doing and if the water has any real character to it. So for instance, the bubbles. If I turn focus stack on, look at those bubbles right there. I kind of like these bubbles a little more, or perhaps even those bubbles. I know bubbles doesn't seem like that's a huge deal, but to me, those little things can add extra elements of interest to the image. So maybe what I want is to keep these bubbles right here in my final image. How would I do that? Well, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the layer with the bubbles that I like a lot at the top. And there's also some other parts up here that I might want to keep as well. So you can see as I turn this on and off, I actually like what the water is doing down here in my focus stacked image. So I'm going to keep all of this, but I like the bubbles more in this image. So how will I get these bubbles from this image into my main image here at the top? Well, the nice thing about grouping things and putting them in a folder is you can then mask that entire folder and everything that's in it to reveal what's underneath everything that's in that folder. So like I've kind of just masked everything. I could have 15 images in here and I can still reveal something underneath these images using the mask tool. So I've got this white mask that I've just put on. I'm going to go to my brush tool. I'm going to go much smaller with the size of that. And I'm also going to take my opacity down a lot. I'm just going to kind of paint in these bubbles as much as I want to. And so now I'm just going to kind of do it. I'm just painting in these bubbles. And I'm going to go a little bigger. You can see that it's not as bright. Those bubbles are not as bright as the ones on the top image. But that's okay, because I can brighten them up. Not a big deal. I'm going to look at that. Yeah, there's the bubbles that I've kind of created there. I can brighten those up though. You can see the difference. I'm going to turn this mask on and off. You can see the difference there between those two. And perhaps this is a little bit darker now than the rest of this image. No big deal, because I've just revealed this image underneath, which is a darker frame. I can up the exposure, use the curves adjustment just on this layer to bring up the exposure here. So I'm going to click on this layer. I'm going to do an adjustment layer for curves. I'm going to create a clipping mask, which basically means this curves adjustment is only going to affect this layer right here, which means it's only going to affect this. So now if you see what I'm doing here, so let's get this out now, and I'm going to bring up that exposure so that it blends in, so those bubbles are nice and bright. I can kind of do whatever I want to with it to make sure it just looks natural. And I want them to be kind of bright. Looks pretty good. I'll kind of go with that. I can turn it on and off. So you just kind of adjust it based on what you're after. And of course, if you adjust it too much, you can then change how strong it is afterwards, or you can go back in and pull the curves back up and adjust them there. So it's completely up to you, but there we go. Now that kind of blends in a little bit better with the rest. You're probably looking at this now. It's catching your eye because I've just made edits to it. But once I'm done, once I've gone and worked my way around this entire image, it's all going to blend together pretty well. Okay, so I'm basically done right now with most of my exposure blending. I'm now going to go through and do my edits to this image, and here in just a few seconds I'll show you the final image that I was able to create. But I hope you learned from this. I hope it gave you some ideas for some things that you can do to your own images, and you learned a little more about how focus stacking works and exposure blending works. Photoshop is a truly powerful piece of software. I can't say enough good things about it. I'm always learning new things, but it really unlocks creative potential. And so now I'm going to finish this edit, and you all are about to see it. Thank you.